Welcome to another episode of Data Skeptic Animal Intelligence. I'm back with co-host Becky Hansis O'Neill. Welcome back, Becky.
It's good to be here. Thanks, Kyle.
Today our topic is about pose estimation and how we can get machines to look at videos of different animals and even insects and all types of things moving around and be able to say, in the same way Andy Serkis gets measured when you put golf balls on him and turn him into some motion capture stuff. How can we do that without gluing the golf balls on him and get really interesting, rich data sets about the way bodies are moving in 3D space?
Totally, which is very useful for the kind of work I do because right now we do all of that by hand with lots and lots of undergraduates, and it's very time consuming. I have not met a grad student or an undergrad that wants to spend their time labeling videos. I think it's good for us to learn about things like inter-rater reliability and how to deal with those kinds of data. But at this point, to me, it's starting to feel outdated. And I would rather students are spending that time on critical thinking skills as opposed to tedious video labeling.
And I know you don't have an exact number, but can you size that up? Like, how many frames per hour per Mountain Dew bottle can the average grad student output,
So we can speed the videos up, and that makes it quite a bit faster. You think back to when I was an undergrad doing this. I was looking at stepping behavior in rat pups, and we were looking at different drugs that might affect their spinal cord that could help with spinal cord injury. So every step of every little foot while they were moving around. And I bet I could do 2 subjects an hour pretty slow. So something like pose estimation, which didn't exist back when I was doing that, we could have labeled each foot and seen exactly what stepping position the baby rats were in, the pups were in. And that's something that could have been automated. I'm sure people are automating this now. And it would have made it much, much faster, or at least where I wouldn't have to be sitting there and it could be done while I went and did something else.
Yeah, there's no reason we can't use machine learning to train the computer to do this sort of labeling anymore. I think it's pretty clear we've got the hardware and the software approaches, but it's still a bit of an arduous process. Although software like SLEAP, S-L-E-A-P, that we talk about today, might help make that a lot easier. And I know, Becky, you had a chance to download that and take a look at it. Could you give me some of your first impressions?
Yeah, so I wanted to play with it and look at some pollinator data because right now I'm helping with a project not related to my research where we're looking at bees visiting flowers in orchards here in St. Louis. And I wanted to see, could we automate any of this? Could we recognize the parts of a honeybee? So I grabbed one of my little video clips and I downloaded SLEAP. And SLEAP has a really nice documentation on GitHub for how to install it. And I ended up I deviated a little bit from their install. So I downloaded something called Anaconda, which was new to me. And I thought, okay, this is kind of like a Python environment. There's all these dependencies. There's no way I'm going to be able to get this to work, right? But their instructions were really, really good. And I found this was much more similar to using R and just getting all your packages, except it was automated better than R. So all those dependencies came in really quick, and I was able to launch the GUI and start labeling my training frames really fast and then go through the training process. And then my machine is a little bit outdated. I have an older GPU, but it was still able to complete the training, and I was able to cycle back through original frames and start looking for bees and seeing if they could be identified using SLEAP. So it was relatively painless. I thought if I can do this as a non-program, non-computer person, other people could do this too.
Well, that's great news. And what do you see about the potential? I know you didn't necessarily spend days with it. Do you think it could eventually learn to recognize what you want it to recognize?
Absolutely, I think it could. And it sent me down a rabbit hole where I thought, okay, this is actually just one step in multiple steps where I get my pose estimation. And then if I need to label behaviors, I use more software to label my behaviors. And then I get this output of what the bee is actually doing. And then I saw there's multiple pipelines and combinations of things to make that happen. So you can really find things that fit what you need. So this sent me down a really cool rabbit hole, and I think absolutely you can make it do what I want it to do.
Well, cool. Let's get into the interview. Look, everybody, data science has been reshaping every industry, and that's not slowing down. All this AI stuff is just going to accelerate it. So whether you want to advance or pivot your career, you should consider the Georgia Tech Scheller College of Business and their 100% online Business Analytics Graduate Certificate program. It'll teach you how to analyze and interpret data. The skills you learn will allow you to succeed anywhere. This online program consists of 4 courses: Business Analytics for Managers, machine learning for business, business data preparation and visualization, and analysis of unstructured data. It's a flexible program. You can go at your own pace. Those of you who want to hit the gas hard can take 2 courses a semester and graduate within a year. The Business Analytics Graduate Certificate is designed for professionals in any industry who want to become data-savvy leaders or pivot into analytics. It can also be your gateway into a Georgia Tech MBA. So are you ready to become a data-savvy leader? Get the skills necessary to do that. Applications for the Georgia Tech Scheller College of Business Business Analytics Graduate Certificate are open now for fall 2024. Visit techgradcertificates.com to learn more. And don't forget to apply before May 1st. That's the deadline. For more information, head over to techgradcertificates.com. In 2023, just 10 vulnerabilities accounted for over half of the incidents responded to by Arctic Wolf Incident Response. Wouldn't you like to know how to take them off the table and make life more difficult for cybercriminals? That's just one of the essential insights you'll find in the Arctic Wolf Lab's 2024 Threats Report, authored by their elite team of security researchers, data scientists, and security development engineers, and backed by the data gained from trillions of weekly observations within thousands of unique environments. This report offers expert analysis into attack types, root causes, top vulnerabilities, TTPs, and more. Discover the attack vectors behind nearly half of all successful cybercrimes, why ransom demands climbed 20% from 2023, and find out why 2024 will be an especially volatile year for cybersecurity. I got my copy. You should get yours by going to arcticwolf.com/dataskeptic. That's arcticwolf.com/dataskeptic.
My name is Talmo Pereira, and I am a Salk Fellow and Principal Investigator at the Salk Institute for Biological Studies in San Diego, California. My lab here at the Salk works on developing deep learning-based tools to study biology writ large, but with a special emphasis on neuroscience and, in particular, animal behavior.
Deep learning is a relatively new idea. When did it first get introduced into your career?
The deep learning revolution started in earnest in around 2012 with engineering advances that really revitalized the idea of using artificial neural networks through the advent of GPU-accelerated algorithms for training these types of neural networks. Around the time that I was starting my PhD in 2015, some of the early work was starting to come out from the field of computer vision that demonstrated that you could use deep learning methods to overcome some of the classical challenges with capturing movement from standard videography. So specifically, the field of pose estimation or human pose estimation had just begun to experience a resurgence through the development of some deep learning-based algorithms that demonstrated that you could do essentially markerless motion capture. Think of this as effectively using a motion capture suit like actors do in Hollywood, where they have these big balls, which really are retroreflective markers that really pop out against infrared. We wanted to do the exact same thing to quantify the movements of the underlying complex behaviors of animals, but we couldn't really ask our animals to wear those same motion capture suits. So when we saw that these technologies were advancing enough that they were working remarkably well in the human domain, I began to work on essentially how could we adapt those approaches to work well in the domain of scientific applications, and in particular in the cases of studying freely moving animals.
So there have been a series of advancements in the computer vision world that definitely do pose estimation well for humans. I know from watching a lot of behind-the-scenes movies things that's come quite a ways, but it's also really built for the human body, which is a lot different from snakes and bees and things like that. Were you starting from scratch, or is there, knowledge transfer going on in these worlds?
That's kind of really the core thing that drove a lot of our work. How do we transfer these ideas, these approaches from the human pose field to, let's generalize it to the domain of all animals, right? All things that can potentially move. Fundamentally, when I really drilled down to the math and to the algorithms of it all, there's nothing that was that specific to humans. The only thing that was specific to humans were the data sets. because there already existed, this predated even deep learning, there existed these massive data sets with hundreds of thousands of images, with millions of humans within those that were already labeled at great expense by human annotators that were, generally crowd workers, where the industry labs essentially, shouldered those expenses. And that just wasn't going to be feasible, because every time we have a new animal, new camera type, whatever it is, we would have fully out-of-domain data. So even if we could use the exact same algorithms, exact same neural networks, it wouldn't matter, because it would be infeasible for every lab to generate their own training data. Basically, saw that it was technically possible. And our idea was, okay, well, we just have to solve the sample efficiency problem. In other words, how do we scale these deep neural networks, these algorithms, to work with just a lot less data? And that's exactly what we did. And we solved that problem during my early PhD work by effectively just scaling down the neural network architectures themselves, as well as employing a whole range of other engineering tricks, effectively, and algorithmic tricks, to deal with the fact that we have a lot less data. And what we found, much to our surprise, was that we could get away with 1,000-fold, 100,000-fold fewer labeled images, labeled examples, and still train the neural networks to achieve the exact same task on entirely new data sets with no transfer learning, with no initialization from previous weights or knowledge reuse, just by baking in the right inductive biases, essentially giving the algorithms the right capabilities to do exactly the task that they needed to do, and not necessarily have to do this in fully unconstrained settings, such as what you normally have in these human pose estimation models that are kind of trained to work in the general use case, where you have unconstrained webcams or phone cameras that can be in any angle or setting. In the lab, we want to control those settings, not just for the purposes of making it easier for the algorithm, but really making it more reproducible and controlled for the science itself.
Could you expand on some of the techniques you use to take advantage of these constraints you knew out of box?
Most fundamental one is essentially just neural network architecture engineering. We want to have the same inputs and outputs, but we want to be able to generate the same outputs from the same inputs that a larger model would, but just using a much smaller model. Now, the way that you scale down a model, very big field, right? Whole network architecture, search field, and lots of other theory around things like scaling laws and so on really help to guide that. But what we found was that there's really just a handful of properties that were important specifically for this pose estimation task. In the case of pose estimation, where the task is given an image, predict the coordinates of the body parts that are contained in that image, rather than directly trying to predict those numerical values, we use a proxy. We use this representation called part confidence maps. These are essentially heat maps. They have like a 2D Gaussian that is centered at the location of those body parts. And because it's an image-like representation, it means that it has a lot of local correlations and local spatial structure, which means that neural network architectures like convolutional neural networks are really, really good at converting an image-like representation, such as images themselves, pixels, to another image-like representation. Because convolutional neural network filters, these kernels, have really strong inductive biases towards learning these local image structures by virtue of their spatial equivariance and a set of other properties. And so by casting the problem into one in which you have this representation, it looks a little bit like semantic segmentation, which falls into this broader class of dense prediction or dense regression tasks that contrast it from things like image classification, which you have a convolutional neural network followed by a bunch of fully connected layers that basically discard the notion of spatial structure entirely. We care really deeply about the spatial structure, almost exclusively. So by having a fully convolutional neural network, we actually end up buying ourselves a lot of gain. Because now, essentially every little patch of the image becomes a new data sample. So even a single labeled image actually gives you a ton of information. It's not just one image is equal to one sample. Really, there's teaching signals at every part of the image. And we can push that further. We can augment it. We can apply random geometric modifications to the image to create new versions of that image. We don't even need to get too fancy. In fact, in our own work, we found that basically just by applying random rotations to the image and nothing else, we get almost perfect generalization. There's this property in neural networks called the receptive field. This is effectively how large of an area in the image are you able to reason about given the architecture that you have. Where you might imagine for a small 3x3 convolution, it can only ever really reason about a 3x3 pixel feature. If you stack those, it can reason about a little bit more because it can kind of remix stuff from the edges, but not that much more. There's actually a nice closed form equation that can describe, given a convolutional architecture, how large the maximum theoretical receptive field is for a given network. And what we did in some of our later work was to leverage that knowledge in order to basically transform this notion of having a desired property. Like, my animal is this large. I want my neural network to be able to reason about something that is 200, 300 pixels, whatever it is. I can invert that and say, like, okay, I want it to be able to reason about this. What is the architecture that would give me that amount of receptive field? And that allows you to configure a custom tailored neural network that is going to be optimally predisposed to being able to learn about the nuances of your data. And what we show is that compared to generalist neural networks, even ones that are pre-trained on massive amounts of data, this buys you so much more performance, both in terms of accuracy, meaning like with 10, sometimes 100 or 1,000-fold fewer parameters, you can get the same exact accuracy, sometimes better, but it'll be 10, 100, 1,000 times faster, which enables the other piece of magic sauce here, which is human-in-the-loop training, or human-in-the-loop labeling, as it's variably called. Sometimes it's also called active learning. If you can train very quickly, and when I say quickly, I mean like in the order of minutes on a single GPU, then you can do some annotation, even on as little as a single image, as I mentioned. You'll label a couple images, build a really nice interface to make that even easier, and train a neural network. Takes a few minutes, go grab a coffee, come back. You now have a neural network that's trained and will predict the poses in new images that you haven't labeled. It won't be as accurate as one that's fully trained with many data points, but it'll do a pretty decent job. And what we found was that every time that you go through this loop of labeling a little bit, training a neural network, generating predictions, the predictions become increasingly more accurate. So it takes less and less time for you to annotate new data, going down from, say, taking like in our own kind of benchmarks around 2 minutes to label an image when you have no prior, just doing it totally from scratch, to just a few seconds by the time that you go through a couple of rounds. As little as like 10 seconds. Because at that point, you're really just fine-tuning, you're just kind of tweaking the little mistakes that the neural network makes, really just in the edge cases. So that makes it such that the whole process, rather than it being kind of where we started off this conversation in like this land where we got to patch together 1 million images, ship it off to Amazon Mechanical Turk, pay $20,000, wait a month, come back, throw away half those labels because it was probably bots or people who weren't paying attention, do a bunch of quality control, massage the data, and now I finally have a data set. Now it's like, no, I can sit on my computer, drag in a video into our software. In an afternoon, I have a neural network that can now automatically track it, and I can move on with my science. That was the step, change in the paradigm.
I think we've, without defining it, been talking a lot about the SLEAP project. Could you maybe spell out the acronym and tell us a little bit about what it's all about?
So SLEAP stands for Social Leap Estimates Animal Poses. It's a spiritual successor of LEAP, which itself stands for Leap Estimates Animal Poses. You can tell that we're big fans of recursive acronyms. So SLEAP evolved out of our early work in developing these methods for animal pose estimation, and SLEAP itself was totally reworked from the ground up as an end-to-end, very user-oriented, practical framework for going through this whole workflow of starting off from a raw video through to importing it and having a really sophisticated labeling and visualization interface. It's desktop-based, It kind of gives you like a Photoshop or Illustrator like, user experience. We're really big on the user experience end of it. It's all architected with best practices, industry grade software engineering. We have, really sophisticated CI and CD pipelines, continuous integration, test-driven development, and all the best practices in architecting and developing these engineering systems. It's all open source and so forth. And it's intended to guide you from having that raw video through to doing the annotation, configuring the neural networks, training them, predicting on new data, tracking, pulling in the results, inspecting them, and then exporting it out for further analysis and whatever you want to do, all without having to code through any of those steps. So it's really trying to bring the core of this technology to a broader audience. And when I say that it's accessible, what I mean is we really want to remove all of the technical barriers to doing this stuff. It's a very powerful technology. It lets you track and analyze all sorts of data, something that I certainly, in my undergraduate years, and many folks still today, spent, thousands of hours kind of just sitting and watching videos and having undergrads with literal stopwatches, recording when things happen in videos. What this allows us to do, we hope this can allow people to do, is to basically replace that undergraduate manual labor that's super tedious and error prone with automation, thereby freeing them up to be able to focus on the actual science and doing more interesting things. I think there's been probably many undergrads who have been scared away from pursuing further careers in this general field of science from the fact that they just have to do a ton of very, very tedious manual labor of just watching the videos and writing down notes. I think as a result of all the emphasis that we put on the accessibility, it's been a real hit, right? We have over 100,000 downloads with over 10,000 unique users in over 50 countries all over the world. And we've had everybody from, middle schoolers who emailed us out of the blue, showing us that, they use it for their science fair projects, which is super cute, super cool, all the way through the more challenging use case of faculty actually learning to use a new software, which is always a bit more of a challenge than for the kids. So we're really proud of that aspect of the work. I feel like we put a lot of work into not shifting the onus onto the users to be like, okay, you guys should just learn how to manage your GPU, your CUDA dependencies, and how to set up all these things, and how to get a very rapidly changing deep learning software ecosystem working on your lab computer, to instead, we know this stuff. I hire software engineers. We, can just smooth out these things to make it so that you don't have to think about the low-level technical nuances of how do you operate a machine learning system in production.
I'm sure that's working if you're getting all these downloads and even middle schoolers figuring it out, but there must be some sort of prerequisite. How advanced were these middle schoolers?
All you really need is a video and a computer. That's really all it takes. It helps if you can click, I suppose. You will need to do a little bit of clicking. That's kind of the extent of it. We kind of come in and we do tutorials and workshops pretty much all the time, at least a few times a month, at external places or online and so forth. We always come in with the assumption that our users don't know what a terminal is. They don't know what a file system is. We always start off from that point. And the feedback that we've gotten pretty consistently is that that's exactly where the pain points are. It's somebody can come in with a PhD in microbiology and understand everything there is to know about the genetics of their model system or something like that, but they never really had to open a terminal and set up a Python packaging system, right? And manage environments and things like that. So we really try to, smooth out all of these little aspects, really focus around the notion of user experiences. We map out user journeys when we come up with new features, right? We put things through rigorous beta testing. We watch people use the thing. We use it for ourselves. We have our own biological questions that we care about. We care about the usability because we're ourselves users and we appreciate what it's like to use software. SLEAP, is a software that we've created, we maintain, we continue to develop, but it's not the only software we use in our science. And as, consumers of scientific software tools, we ourselves appreciate what good software engineering and design especially can bring to the table, right? It can save you hundreds of hours of troubleshooting something and helping to reduce the time it takes for us to understand if we're doing something wrong or if the system is messing up. If this is like, our data is just something that's new that's never seen before, and so it just doesn't work for this particular use case versus something that's well documented and helps us understand, how can we get to a point where we can use the core functionality of the software, they only change one thing for our use case. That notion of that user experience and user journey is something that I think is a lot more appreciated in industry where there is a profit motive than it is in science in which this is generally not something that's very well recognized. The recognition that we got took a while. It took us to, until we built a user base and we started getting more and more routine feedback. And now it's pretty much something we get every day. If somebody's saying that, oh, they tried out another software, they tried out another tool, or they even tried to do it to build something themselves. Then they tried out our thing, and they're like, "Oh my god, this solves all these problems." You guys thought about all the little issues hiccups that come up along the way, and it's because yes, we did because we needed it ourselves, and because we listened to our users. We always have the philosophy that if somebody's asking us a question, then there's probably 10 other people who didn't bother to ask the question. So we never dismiss something as like exclusively user error or that they don't understand how it's done. They don't understand how it's done. Maybe the software is too confusing. Not that the user, doesn't know what they're doing.
So is it correct to describe it really as a fully baked software application, not really a software development kit or SDK?
That's correct, yeah. In fact, if anything, it's more so of a user-oriented software than it is let's say, a developer-oriented software. We're actually right now working on building out more of the ecosystem around it to make it more accessible to other developers, because we did put a lot of work into the engineering. And as a result, we have this massive code base with tens of thousands of lines of code that are pretty inscrutable. Despite the fact that we maintain pretty high standards of testing and documentation, it's still any code base that hits a critical mass is just very, very intractable to build around. And the dependency stack around deep learning and GUI-based software, graphical user interface-based software, is challenging to say the least, especially because we support it across multiple platforms. As a key example, I spent most of yesterday with one of the folks in my lab, basically just troubleshooting our Conda package build because it would work on Windows, and then suddenly it would break on Linux, and then it breaks on the new Apple Silicon chips, and then it doesn't work on this Python version, it doesn't work on that. So it's a game of whack-a-mole, and you have to go deep into the open source GitHubs for really core dependencies like OpenCV and TensorFlow to see like what the developers are thinking in terms of, okay, there's a new version of OpenCV that just came out, boom, our entire stack breaks because it's just, you pull one thread of these tech dependency stacks and the whole thing falls apart. We're working right now to kind of break out some of the core functionalities of SLEAP into independent packages that are a lot more, SDK-like than the core SLEAP. And in particular, we're really focusing on data standards and having things that can basically, right now, SLEAP already supports importing data from all sorts of different softwares. Pretty much any major software that's in this general field, SLEAP can import, so you don't have to redo your work if you've already done annotation. But importantly, you can also export the results, the predictions, in a variety of different formats, ranging from like plain text, like CSVs, to like more structured HTML5, to one of our collaborators and colleagues format called Neurodata Without Borders. It's where they're a whole organization built around the notion of data specifications. It's really one of the things that we spent the most time on in one of these engineering pieces that are largely not appreciated in the field is the data model. The data model meaning we thought really hard about the data structures that should surround the core workflow and not just like the data format. Decoupling the concept of what are the core pieces of data structures that need to get moved around that probably represent the richness of this kind of data versus how it's stored on disk. And by decoupling those two, it makes it way easier for us to put anything in the language of this data model and then convert it out to a whole bunch of different formats. And what that permits is interoperability and, importantly in science, reproducibility, right? So you're not locked into some software. You always take our stuff out of SLEAP and use it for dozens of different downstream applications.
So I'm wondering if you could walk through a new user's experience. Let's say they've got a video of like a giraffe. They download SLEAP, they install it locally, they import their video. What's the annotation process like?
You basically are going to pull in your video. No, there's no magic to that. There's just a button that says add video. Ideally, you're going to drop in a bunch of videos that represent the totality of your experiment or diversity in your data. And you're going to define a skeleton. A skeleton is just a list of body part names that it is that you want to track. And that's totally up to you. There's no constraints on that. And then you're going to define what we call our labeling suggestions, which is basically, there's a lot of strategies for data annotation. And the key to when you have relatively few images is to maximize diversity. If you label 100 images, they're the first 100 frames of your video, your neural network is going to really suck at generalizing it to the last 100 frames. Compare that to labeling 100 frames that are interspersed all across your video, beginning, middle, and end. It's going to do way better at generalizing to a lot more diverse conditions. And so that idea we try to bake in into the interface of the workflow itself. So we have a little applet, little panel within SLEAP that lets you basically create like a little queue, a little task list, if you will, which is just going to be a list of frames that are sampled either evenly interspersed across your videos or using image content clustering methods that are intended to kind of help to capture the more diverse sets of images. But frankly, most of the time, maybe 90% or more of the time, just picking stuff that's spaced out in time, it's a pretty good starting point. But at the end of the day, it's just about clicking and dragging a set of nodes that are all labeled, say head, tail, neck, etc. You're just going to click and drag and position those on top of the correct location that they should be on the images. And you're going to do that for every animal within a frame, and then you've labeled a frame. And you can basically stop there and already train a neural network. Or you can go through and label a few more. And then when you're ready to train your neural network, you just go to the menu, run training, a window will pop up that'll have a whole bunch of settings that you can configure. It's a lot of settings, there's a lot of parameters in neural networks, but what we do is we try to guess as many as we can based on your data. And the defaults are tuned to already work with the vast majority of use cases. And if they don't, we have little drop downs that have a set of presets for the most common alternative use cases. What you'll typically see is that at the beginning of training, it'll do a really good job. You'll start to see it learn to output some density of confidence around the really easy body parts, the ones that are very clearly visible and less variable. And then as training progresses, you'll see that it'll start to what you'll typically see is that it'll typically mix up left and right related body parts. And there'll be some ambiguity there. But as training progresses, it'll sharpen it up and learn to distinguish those two. And just by watching it do its thing, you're already building an intuition for what the AI is doing, what the neural networks are doing. And that adds this whole other dimension to the user experience where now you're not just treating the algorithm as a black box, but you're kind of learning with it. The body parts that they found more confusing are the ones that it's more likely going to be making errors on. So now you can focus your second round of training on just correcting the ones that are the trickier cases, the harder cases. I like to, in the beginning, recommend essentially intermixing some easy ones with some hard ones so that you're kind of like giving it effectively a training curriculum, just like you would with a student. You wouldn't immediately give them the hardest question. You kind of warm them up by making it progressively more difficult. That ultimately saves you a lot of time because it takes a lot more time to correct the hard ones than it does to correct the easy ones. So if you kind of gradually step up, you're always just correcting the ones that is just a little bit off, and you'll just basically iterate through this. You can also even just sort them by the confidence scores, which is another feature that you get with this labeling suggestions table. That allows you to focus on the things that it's very confident about, potentially overconfident, which also is a great teaching signal, as well as the ones that it's not very confident about, typically ones that it's not doing very well on. So again, really working back and forth with the algorithm so you're building a deep understanding of how it works without having to really dig into the math or the engineering side of it.
Do you have any observations or best practices about that process? Should I label 10, 20, 30, then watch it and iterate again? Or what's an effective way to go about this?
Generally speaking, you'll roughly want to kind of double it every time. You'll do 10 frames first, get a baseline for how it works. Then, train again at 20 after you found a bunch that, it wasn't doing well on. Then go to 40, 80, is 60 and so forth. And as you get past 100, you'll typically start spacing that out a little bit further. But most folks will get away with, if it's a relatively small scale project, under 100 labeled frames. If it's a really large scale project, you want to do this on millions of frames, which is a pretty common use case. You probably want to get to a couple thousand frames before you have like really, really stable results. But importantly, once you get to the first 1,000, you really just want to hit everything that you can. But as you're going past that, it's pretty heavily diminishing returns. So you really just want to focus on that long tail, only the ones that it's really getting wrong. Like you're really not buying yourself that much by adding more frames that it's already doing perfect on. It can help a little, but mostly you're going to do better by just focusing on where it's not doing well. And when it's not doing well, it's typically in situations in which animals are very closely interacting, where there's a lot of heavy occlusion, just inherent uncertainty. You can't predict where the body part is if you can't see it. We do have a feature in SLEAP that lets you basically toggle the visibility of a node of a body part to say that it's not visible. And that actually lets you calibrate this certainty estimate. That's one of these more advanced a tweak that ends up helping a lot. If you can't see it, it's oftentimes better to just tell the neural network to not try to guess it, but rather just be confident that you can't see it. That way, the confidences that it assigns the predictions are a lot more calibrated to the true uncertainty inherent in the data.
And could you speak to the use case? I'm thinking most specifically about insects, but the case where the frame has a lot of examples of the animal I'm interested in.
Definitely one thing is you have to make sure that you label every instance of the frame, right? Otherwise, if some animals aren't labeled, they're treated as background. That's going to totally throw off your neural network. It's a super common mistake that people made. Ultimately, the harder part is not really going to be in the pose estimation itself. It's going to be in the identity tracking, which we really haven't touched on so far. Identity tracking, in contrast to pose estimation, is the task of you have a bunch of detected poses, where again, a pose is just a set of these landmarks that are all connected to each other, belonging to a single animal. So you have a bunch of poses on one frame, you have a bunch of poses in the next frame. How do I know which one corresponds to the same animal across the two frames? And often, it's the case that when you have a lot of animals that are very closely interacting, those poses are going to be really start to kind of merge together and be on top of each other. So it becomes very challenging, purely based on that information, to reliably assign these detectors to each other. Mostly, you'll improve your tracking performance by improving the poses themselves. The less noisy the poses, the more reliable the tracking. But there's still going to be some limit to that. And fundamentally, tracking is always going to be a much harder problem because it's a sort of a much lower tolerance to error. That is to say, even if you have a pose algorithm that's 99.9% correct, which is really a poor way to describe it, because pose is something that it's continuous, right? Like it's something correct if you miss it by a couple pixels or by 10 pixels. Unclear. When it comes to identities, this is absolutely clear cut. Either ant1 is ant1 in the next frame, or it's ant2 in the next frame. If I say that it's ant2 in the next frame, it is 100% wrong. There's no nuance to it. And the issue is that most trackers work by associating things across time, which means that if you have an algorithm that's 99.9% correct, sounds great, but if I have 1,000 ants in my field of view and I get one of them wrong, it is now wrong for the rest of my frames. And in fact, I probably got not just that one ant wrong, but the other one that I mistook it with. Now I have two ants that are the incorrect identity for the rest of time, until I make a mistake again. And this notion, this issue of error propagation is really the Achilles heel of identity tracking, and more broadly, the multi-object tracking field in computer vision. And so we're actively working on things to improve upon that, including more sophisticated learnable algorithms that can take advantage of both space and time and appearance in clever ways. But ultimately, because it's a task that has zero tolerance, it means that no matter how good your algorithm is, you're still going to need to do some amount of quality control. What we instead have done is to create, again, focusing on the user experience, tools to be able to pull the predictions back in, very quickly compute a bunch of heuristics that let you identify frames that are likely to have these identity switches, and make it really easy for you to correct them within the interface by using hotkeys, using different kinds of features. You fix it on one frame, and then it'll propagate to the subsequent frames. You toggle that on and off. But at the end of the day, If you have multiple animals, you have to look at your videos. You need to do some level of quality control because of this fundamental issue with identity tracking problem.
Well, the researchers should know their own data set, so they likely have some idea about, how many outliers or what outlier type things are there. And using your interface through the annotation, as you said, I think they'll get an intuition for it's working or it's not. Earlier, it didn't know left from right, but 50 examples later, now it does. And maybe they can rely on that intuition to say the model's ready, but that's a lot different from what I learned in machine learning class with accuracy and F1 score and stuff like that. Where do you meet in the middle?
Yeah, that's a great question. So we put a lot of work into our metrics and evaluation frameworks. Measuring the accuracy of pose itself is something that is less straightforward to define than in other kinds of tasks like image classification or other things where there's very clear discrete categories. We adopted a couple of different things. And a lot of it is really just inspired by some really cool work, particularly from Pietro Perona at Caltech, who published this really seminal paper in 2017 in TVPR on the taxonomy in categories of pose errors. Like it's like in this example of getting left and right wrong. We call this sort of like a transposition as compared to like just getting the key point off by a few pixels. Each one of those has their own kind of ways that we end up dealing with it. But at the core of it, the most important one is this object key point similarity metric. And I'm really enamored by it because I feel like it's a very clever way to deal with the notion that, a 2-pixel error could be very great if your object is like very large. If I want to track somebody's eyes and, I have a 100 megapixel image, 2 pixels is nothing, right? It's going to be like microns. If I have a 100 pixel by 100 pixel image and I get it 2 pixels off, that might mean that I'm off by centimeters to meters. There is this issue of dealing with scale variability. But then there's also this issue of, okay, even assuming a fixed scale, what is a good error rate? And it's not clear. There are fundamental limitations to the algorithms themselves. We talked about receptive field size. There's also other properties that we can imbue with the neural network related to like the resolution of the confidence maps and the relative localization accuracy that is even theoretically achievable. But then there's also the accuracy that is limited by the trained data itself. So for example, if you ask 30 humans to label the same exact image, they're not going to click on the exact same spots. But it turns out that that's actually dependent on the body part that you're asking them to click on. This has been reported for a long time, known for a long time, and calibrated by lots of crowdsourced workers for a long time in human pose estimation, where the eyes are ones that are most reliable. Ask 100 people to click on them, they're going to be off by very, very little. But if you ask 100 people to click on the left hip, this is an internal body part that's covered by fat, it's covered by tissue, it's covered by clothes, and it's often also a lot more ambiguous depending on the pose and viewpoint. So they're going to be off by a lot more. And I picked these two examples because these are the two extremes, effectively. So there are a set of constants, set of numbers that describe the variance of a Gaussian distribution centered on the ground truth of those key points that can be used to normalize the relative distances. And that's what goes into this object key point similarity metric, in addition to factoring in the scale of the subject, so how far or close they are, or the resolution of the image, as well as factoring in visibility, or in other words, whether you've missed a body part, which introduces another challenge, because how many pixels off are you if you fail to detect a body part entirely, right? It's just undefined. So do I count that as 0? Do I count that as infinity? There's no obvious answer there. And so, again, this object key point similarity metric tries to factor all these things in. But the challenge is just that when in our case, because we have we've generalized this to the universal domain of all body part types, we don't have those constants for all different animal bodies in every type of data set. In SLEAP, by default, we bias towards being the most conservative and just use the constant for the left hip of humans, which is definitely basically when we compute our error metrics, it's always effectively an underestimate. We try to consider it as a lower bound because for the majority of key points people are tracking, they're probably a lot more readily visible and people will be less variable in labeling them than people would be with labeling left hip key point in humans. But it gives people like a more honest and lower bound on the true performance. But we do think about these things a lot. So that's kind of where we try to bridge the two.
Well, what's the future of the project?
Clearly, I care about pose estimation and pose tracking. My whole lab does, right? That's a big aspect of all the stuff that we do. But at the end of the day, we're a neuroscience lab. We also work in plants. We also work with humans. We work with microscopy data and tracking cells and organelles. So we're tracking mice in space in a recent collaboration with NASA. Ultimately, what we want to do is leverage this information with the intent of understanding how the brain works. And the fundamental observation there is that the brain evolved to enable movement. The whole reason we have nervous systems is because of the evolutionary pressure on ancient biological organisms that needed to be able to sense their environment and convert that information into better movement so that they can move away from prey, from predators, move towards prey and other food, move towards mates, allow them to survive and pass on their genes. And this pressure was so strong that it led to the development of the nervous system and eventually the brain. We have a great tool to quantify biological motion from standard video. That's great. But going back to the evolutionary motivation for when we even care about biological movement, we need to acknowledge the fact that the brain did not evolve to control key points. The brain evolved to control the body. And the key points are just a visible proxy for the underlying biological structures that can enable movement. And what that is the body. It's the skeleton, it's muscles, it's motor neurons, and it's other soft tissues. And it's their intersections with the biomechanics of their constellation and the physics of the real world. There's all sorts of cool deep learning and modeling work that's been done more recently to extract more insights out of the key point trajectories. Because at the end of the day, you end up with a bunch of X and Y coordinates. That's not biology, right? You need to kind of extract some sense out of that. And for that, we really would like to point your listeners to key point MoSeq. This is a recent approach from our collaborators at Harvard and Stanford that I think that integrates well with SLEAP. And it's a really clever way, I think, to pull out discrete structure in the time series of postural trajectories. But really, the thing that is going to get us to unlock new layers of biology, new layers of neuroscience, is acknowledging the body in all its glory, right? All the gory details of its biomechanics. Because ultimately, if we can map neural signals to movement of realistic bodies, then we now have the generative process that gives rise to the pose trajectories in the first place. And so what we're really excited about now, in collaboration with lots of cool folks, is to build these body models inside of physics simulators. Think of these as like video game engines, where we can now train AI models to play a video game, much like Google DeepMind has done for like Atari games and Go and so forth, right? Except that this AI's objective is to play this video game where its controls are muscle activations, and its objective is to control the body, a realistic body of an animal, to match the kinematic trajectories that we can extract from the pose. So now we're trying to basically reproduce the process that evolution was trying to optimize for, that resulted in giving rise to the brain. And so by simulating the process that gave rise to the brain, we're hoping that gets us way closer to being able to reproduce the brain itself in silico. As we do so, we can confirm that it can still do the same things that the brain can. It can process information the same way, and it can produce the same kinds of outputs. But then we can leverage all our deep understanding of neural network engineering to actually engineer this neural network to not just have the same inputs and outputs as the brain, but to have the same kinds of internal structure as the brain, leverage the same connectivity, leverage the same kinds of computations. And in doing so, we're going to be able to then move a lot of the kinds of neuroscience that we normally have to do in the lab to computer simulations, and do so in a way that allows us to generate hypotheses and predictions about what would happen if we did certain kinds of experiments in the lab, do them at scale, generate the top hypotheses, validate them in the lab, learn something new. Maybe we get the predictions wrong, but we can then feed that data back in to iteratively improve our models of how the brain works. And so we're super excited about this. We feel like it's a totally new way to do neuroscience. Fundamentally, it could be another big step shift in how we do computational neuroscience. And I feel like it's the one true, important application for this core technology. Because at the end of the day, brain does not control key points, it controls bodies.
Well, it's a really exciting direction. I look forward to following it. Where's the best place to go online to do that?
Yeah, you can check out our lab website at talmolab.org. You can check out sleep.ai for sleep and sleep-related news. And otherwise, just stay tuned. We'll always post about our work on X, at TalmoP. Definitely stay tuned. I think there's going to be a lot of work that's going to be coming out quite soon from our colleagues and collaborators that are going to be really defining this whole new field of simulated bodies and neuro AI.
We'll have links to all the above in the show notes for people to follow up. Telmo, thank you so much for taking the time to come on and share your work.
Yeah, my pleasure. Thanks.